For my final project, I chose to research the question how have the Chinese and Arabian dances from the Nutcracker contributed to the creation of Oriental stereotypes. So we're all familiar with the story of the Nutcracker and how in the second act, Clara enters into a magical land where she's entertained by dancers from different cultures around the world. Two of the most identifiable and the most problematic cultural representations are of the Chinese and Arabian. So starting with the Arabian dance in the Nutcracker, which is representative of the Middle East, we all probably recognize the most identifiable Arabian gesture as the angled Egyptian-style arms. Although Egyptian is in North Africa, it is usually considered a Middle Eastern country, so the presence of the angled arms from Egyptian iconography is appropriate in representing Arabian culture. However, some other gestures, such as prayer hands, are not. They're actually representative of Indian culture, which is typically not included under like the Middle Eastern umbrella, and it's actually common in Hindu practices. So you can already see some inaccuracies in the cultural representation. So dance scholar Jennifer Fisher actually breaks down the huge array of Arabian dances into three more identifiable categories that she calls the comic harem narrative, the classically exotic Arabian, and ethno-fantasies. So out of the three most common types of Arabian dances, the ethno-fantasies are usually seen as the most respectable attempt at creating a realistic representation of Middle Eastern dance. The costumes include long pants and tunics with heeled shoes. The women wear their hair in long braids, and overall they stray away from the classical ballet look and from doing a lot of classical ballet movements. The legs are usually kept a lot lower, and there's not a lot of things like pirouettes. The ethno-fantasy Arabian dances are also sometimes, they also sometimes use flexed feet, and they have a kind of like tilted warrior pose that was seen in certain kinds of court dances. The main issue with the ethno-fantasies is that while they do try to represent traditional folk dance, it's usually very theatricalized. So they pick and choose what looks beautiful for the stage rather than what will provide the most accurate representation of Middle Eastern culture. The classically exotic Arabian is a little bit more problematic. It incorporates the Egyptian angled arms and uses back bends that are both common hallmarks of Arabian dances, but it also has a lot more elements of classical ballet movement. So the dancers act like they have very cool and serious personas, and this style of Arabian dance portrays a very glamorized Hollywood interpretation of Arabian culture. They're made to satisfy audiences' curiosity about exotic Arabian culture. The women are more scantily clad and definitely have a more seductive kind of aura. This style of Arabian is also sometimes inspired by belly dancers. So the costumes include like the bare stomach, and they take on the persona of that kind of popularized Hollywood belly dancer. But for the most part, the Arabian dances actually completely lack any of the traditional movements performed by belly dancers, such as like the shimming of the shoulders or hips. So the classically exotic Arabian, it utilizes glamorized images of the Middle Eastern culture and really only superficially incorporates traditional belly dance rather than being an accurate representation. So the comic harem narrative in particular uses a lot of negative Oriental stereotypes. Mainly, this style of Arabian dance perpetuates the idea of moral laxity and excessive indulgence in Middle Eastern culture. Being called the comic harem narrative, you can probably guess that the setting is a harem where there's a man and his wife and his concubines. So this style utilizes mime really heavily to represent kind of crude behaviors, but tries to present them in ways that are comedic or humorous. So there's a 1968 version of the Nutcracker from the Royal Ballet where the Arabian dance uses this form. So in the beginning, there's a man and a woman and a boy. Not one woman, there's a man, lots of women, and a boy sitting around what looks like a huge plate, and for the most part they're just like miming things. They start bowing, and the man mimes grabbing food off the plate and eating it. Everything they do is super over exaggerated, and when the girls reach into the plate, like, he slaps their hands away until he eventually starts to feed them himself. About a minute into the dance, the boy and one of the women break off and start to do more choreography. Their choreography utilizes what Fisher calls the Arabian staples, which includes the Egyptian angled arms. They have a lot of back bends, and there's a lot of tilting of the pelvis. So while they dance, the man continues to mime feeding the women, and at one point even kisses one. So at the end of the narrative, the boy and the girl who went off to dance end up tricking the man by having the girl distract him as the boy steals a pouch of money off the man's belt. So we can obviously how this particular narrative plays into the stereotype of women as sexual servants to masters, and how they're forced to obey and dance for them, as well as the kind of cunning and trickery displayed by the boy who steals from the wealthy man. Moving on to the Nutcracker Chinese dance, the most identifiable gesture is the pointed finger gesture. This is the gesture made by bending both elbows and holding your index fingers up next to your head. Although this is the most recognizable shape when representing people of Chinese origin in ballet, it actually isn't found in any traditional Chinese dances. The first appearance of the pointed finger gesture is from an iconograph of the French opera ballet, Les Ans de Galante, in 1735. It appears again many times in the next several centuries, but certainly gained the most popularity and recognition from its use in the Nutcracker. There are many theories as to what the gesture is actually supposed to represent. So one theory is that the pointed fingers are supposed to represent chopsticks. There is a traditional Mongolian chopstick dance where the dancers hold up chopsticks in the air, but there's some issues with that being the accurate representation, because first of all, in the 1700s, when the gesture first appeared in Les Ans du Galant, chopsticks were not widely popular in Mongolia yet. Also, at the time, Mongolian culture had not yet been spread to places like France, so it's incredibly unlikely that the choreographers would have ever seen a traditional Mongolian dance and had been inspired to imitate it in that way. A more likely theory is that the pointed finger gesture is representative of the long nails often worn by the Chinese wealthy. As early as the 1500s, there were Chinese travelers that would go through Europe telling tales, and a popular topic was the long fingernails worn by the Chinese upper class. As this wasn't a common European practice, it became a purely Chinese characteristic in the mind of Europeans. Although without any documentation or proof, it's hard to say if that's actually what the pointed finger represents. So for a long time, because of the Nutcracker and other ballets that utilize the finger point gesture, people have associated and identified a culture by a single shape that's not actually indicative of any known dance or movement from Chinese culture. Many people now know that the gesture... So for a long time, because of the Nutcracker and other ballets that utilize the finger point gesture, people have associated and identified the culture by a single shape that's not actually indicative of any known dance or movement from Chinese culture. So many people now know the gesture to be a cliche and consider it to be an Oriental stereotype that represents a poor attempt at being culturally accurate. Traditionally, Oriental Chinese dances were incorporated into ballets and operas to provide comedic relief. They were a very one-dimensional representation of Chinese culture. Some of the more silly portrayals of Chinese culture Traditionally, Oriental Chinese dances were incorporated into ballets and operas to provide comic relief. They were a very one-dimensional representation of Chinese culture. Some of the more silly portrayals of Chinese culture often included in the Nutcracker are head-wagging, excessive bowing, and clown-like miming. Particularly excessive bowing shows like a bad cultural representation because the Chinese use bowing as a sign of respect and sincerity when greeting one another. So using it in excess for humorous purposes lessens the importance of its use in actual Chinese culture. There are movements from the Nutcracker Chinese dances that are somewhat more aesthetically representative of Chinese dances, such as sharp multiple turns, high jumps, acrobatics, and small hops on point. Orlando Ballet's Nutcracker from 2012 included a Chinese dance that incorporated many of these movements. It featured two male leads that began right away with the finger point gesture. They make animated faces while performing massive jumps and maintaining the finger point. They move on to doing a quick bow to each other into a high pike jump, which they repeat several times. In this Chinese dance, there was both incorporation of high jumps and sharp turns, and also less accurate movements such as the bowing and finger point gesture. Another example is from the Mariinsky Ballet, where their Chinese dance has a male and a female dancer. It begins with very small and quick runs around the stage before both dancers go straight into a very high and quick jump. Since the woman's on point, when they do the hops together, she hops on the box of her point shoes, and while the woman does quick double pirouettes from fifth, the man does quick double tours. Like the Orlando Ballet Chinese dance, the male in this performance also does the high pike jumps while the woman hops on point. For both of the performances, the dancers are wearing what looks like imitations of traditional silk Chinese outfits that the Chinese upper class may have worn, paired with a bamboo-style hat that would have been worn by Chinese rice farmers. So while each piece may have had some accuracy separately, it's unlikely that they would have ever been paired together. And this kind of lack of attention to detail lets stereotypes like that iconic Chinese hat to continue being how people pictured Chinese traditional clothing. Both the Arabian and Chinese dances from the Nutcracker have cultural inaccuracies that emphasize Oriental stereotypes. Their representations in ballet draw upon features that satisfy audiences' ideas of an exotic fantasy Orient rather than an accurate representation. It would be really easy to allow cancel culture to destroy the Nutcracker, but as Lindsay Winship, a writer for The Guardian, says, our aim shouldn't be to just call out racist elements in classical ballets, but to spark creative problem solving. There are ways for the Nutcracker to evolve while persevering tradition. It would be really easy to allow cancel culture to destroy the Nutcracker, but as Lindsay Winship, a writer for The Guardian, says, our aim shouldn't be to just call out racist elements in classical ballets, but to spark creative problem solving. There are ways for the Nutcracker to evolve while preserving tradition. For example, Pacific Northwest Ballet danced an Arabian dance where the dancer represented a peacock rather than using Middle Eastern stereotypes. By replacing the Egyptian angled arm with extended elbows that imitated wings, they moved more towards an abstract concept. Winship offers a similar suggestion for the Chinese dance, where the dancer represents a cricket. The cricket is a notable symbol in Chinese culture and could imitate many of the hopping and jumping movements already associated with traditional Chinese dances, while eliminating the negative stereotypes found in Chinese ballet dancing. Other companies have decided to move away from using different cultures as the concept for the second act of the Nutcracker. My home studio actually completely reworked their Nutcracker this year to do that. The second act took place inside of Drosselmeyer's candy shop, and as each dance began, they presented Clara with a candy. The dancers no longer used the stereotypical movements and steps that made them identify with certain cultures. And these are just some of the ways that people are working to keep the Nutcracker alive. Although some people may argue that in the 21st century, with an abundance of information and exposure to other cultures, people look less towards theater and dance productions for accurate and historical information, the Nutcracker is still a large part of popular entertainment and may often be children's first exposure to other cultures. So it's important that we work to represent cultures with the respect and accuracy that they deserve.